Ricciardo goes for it from a long way back. This would be sensational if he makes it. And do you know what? He has made it. Smiles will be out at 18 years and 227 days old. Max Verstappen wins a Formula One Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton wins the Portuguese Grand Prix. Hamilton has more wins than any other driver in Formula One history. And he is not done yet.
Welcome to Getting a Grip F1. I'm your host, Joshua Wells, and today I'm joined by a very special guest from New Zealand, one of the gurus of racing over there, Josh Revell. You'll know him from YouTube, Twitter, and all the social medias. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Thanks very much, Josh, for having me on.
I think we have great names. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I'd campaign for that. Yeah, for sure.
Today, we're going to be talking all things New Zealand racing, including the Toyota Racing Series and the New Zealand Grand Prix. But before we get stuck into all things racing, let's get to know Josh Revell a little bit, mate. Tell us about yourself. What got you into the sport, your experiences, and why do you love it so much?
Well, it started off at a young age, really loving the sport. My first introduction to Formula One came through playing the Formula One 2001 PS1 game. Too many ones in there. But at the age of 5 was where it all sort of kicked off. And then 2003, 2004, that's when New Zealand started to get a little bit more sort of modern. And so we got highlights of races. We didn't necessarily get live ones, but even with the live races, they're 1 a.m. in the morning for us. So at the age of 7 or 8, I was never going to watch those ones. But yeah, just watching highlights at about 2003, 2004 was my sort of first introduction to actual Formula One, watching races. I think the first Grand Prix I remember watching was 2003, 2004 German Grand Prix. And since 2008, pretty much been watching every race live since then. And
when you became an adult or a teenager?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically got to a point where the parents didn't mind me being up at those hours of the night, and when I, would secretly sleep at school as a result. Just the struggles of Southern Hemisphere and watching F1A.
Oh, I feel
I've always had the sort of passion to make films in any slight, and obviously my YouTube account, there's a certain style of filmmaking, which is obviously unique, but it's obviously got its fans, and I thought, because it was inspired by a lot of what other people did. And I know at the time there wasn't really anything like that on F1 YouTube. And I thought, why don't I just do it? And created with it. I've developed it over time, obviously. And, I definitely enjoy doing it. I'm in a lucky position where it's my living now. So it's really just a combination of two of my biggest passions really in life, which is racing and filmmaking, even if the filmmaking is a little bit off. But no, in all seriousness though, it is pretty cool. And that's a very, very, very basic brief oversight of sort of when it all started off and where I am now.
I think you're one of the people in this world. I've always, that just proves one of my points. I've always been a believer in games for sport, to develop them as a marketing tool. And you've just sort of proven it right there. Like if you think about it, so when I was a kid as well in Australia, there was barely any F1 when you didn't know about it. We only had it on pay TV, I believe. And even then it was highlights as well. So like yourself, I got a game in 2004, I think it was, on a PS2 or something like that. That was just F1 and a racing wheel for Christmas. And that was my first ever experience with F1 as well.
When it comes to picking up the sport, there aren't at the moment very many moments which are sort of widely known. I think very few times do the general public generally talk about F1. So you talk about like Romain Grosjean's accident in Bahrain. That was when the public knew about it, because it was something completely abnormal. Otherwise, the sport is sort of, for lack of a better term, too boring. for the general public to sort of take notice without the intervention of like games or YouTube or whatever. So I mean, yeah, definitely those aspects are critical, really, to Formula One, because it on itself isn't sort of doing the sport any favors at the moment, really.
Yeah, and I think in terms of Australian exposure, it's very lucky we've had guys like Daniel Ricciardo and Mark Webber in the last 10 years to really pump it up. So we're looking over to you, Liam Lawson. Let's get going.
Oh man, I mean, I made that video on what it takes to get to Formula One, and then when you see that, you're just like, oh, it's just so depressing, really, just how much it costs to get there, and how much talent is, especially on our side of the world. We both know just how much freaking talent we got over here, and how little of it even gets to cars at all. We're speaking any type of cars, let alone Formula One. So, we talk about Liam Lawson, but it's ultra competitive, even with the Red Bull backing or the Rodin cars backing or his own personal backing from Tuner's cars. It's still an ultra competitive field against, some of those rich billionaire sons, like that's what you're up against, really.
Exactly. And I think it's underrated. No, I think even away from the financial aspect, you're right. In any sport in Australia or New Zealand, think about soccer, think about racing, all those globally recognized sports. It's so hard for athletes to cut through. And you're right. If you're not a billionaire, then, it just becomes even harder. You could be the next Michael Schumacher, but I think he even said, like, you could just be driving a tractor. You could be out there doing a day job because you never made it, because you couldn't compete against the politics and the money. And unfortunately, that's something that we suffer down in the Southern Hemisphere a little bit. And if it wasn't for the Melbourne GP, I wonder where some of these drivers might be.
Yeah, no, exactly.
All right, Josh, well, let's get stuck right into everything in New Zealand racing. We'll spin that and make it more positive, because there's a lot out there. And as you said, there's a lot of good drivers. So we'll start with the Toyota Racing Series. I don't think too many people around the world might not know about it unless you die hard like yourself. So tell me exactly, what is the Toyota Racing Series in New Zealand?
Right. So the Toyota Racing Series is very basically sort of a Formula 3 style championship. And it's run on the European off-season, which is one of only two sort of open wheel series run in the off-season alongside F3 Asia. And this has been going on since 2005. And back then it was a primarily New Zealand talent field, apart from the odd international driver. And I think since 2011, 12, it started to get more and more international drivers. And now it's at a point where we'd be lucky if we get one or two New Zealand drivers in the field and amongst all this international talent. But it's attracted quite a few people lately. Like, it's just, last year, for example, we had Yuki Tsunoda in the field, who's now driving for AlphaTauri in Formula One. Other drivers who have driven for that same team, Daniel Kvyat's been here, Brendan Hartley. We've also had other Formula One drivers, Lance Stroll, Will Stevens, Lando Norris, and Nicholas Latifi as well. So, and I know I'm missing out some more, but it's in those few short years, we've still had those types of talents coming through, and even more besides, just like Nick Cassidy, Scotty Pye, just talent for days, really, that have gone on to achieve some great things. So when you look at the field, that quite a few of these kids are going to go on to achieve some fantastic things, and that's what makes it an exciting championship for sure.
Yeah, well, it is a championship. So tell everyone how it works and the length of the season and, what they're actually competing for.
Right. So there are several sort of trophies throughout the year. So, for example, there's Lady Wigram, the Chris Amon Trophy, New Zealand Grand Prix, the New Zealand Motor Cup, and they're spread off across 5 rounds, which is generally what comprises the calendar. 5 rounds across New Zealand, with 3 races per weekend. So they've changed the rules lately. I don't know if it's sort of a standalone thing, due to the circumstances for this year, but nevertheless, it generally is that type of format. And generally the last round serves as the New Zealand Grand Prix, but of course this year it was the first round because reasons. But yeah, it does. You generally get kids of about 16, 17, 18 years old coming through to the series. Almost every year we've got a driver from an academy, whether it be Red Bull, Renault, Ferrari, whatever. So it's always just becoming sort of a stacked grid full of talent, competing on New Zealand circuits, which are sort of stuck in the 1900s in terms of quality. Apart from the one good one we've got at Hampton Downs. Nonetheless, though, it to have those cars, that type of talent, and that format of racing on those types of tracks, it often leads to some pretty exceptional racing. And I think we've seen in the last few years just the popularity of the series has just gotten sort of more so, really.
So you mentioned how there's so much international talent coming. Is that because it's become a bit of a development series during the winter? And do you think that negatively affects New Zealand's racing community, considering that there's international talent in some ways taking a spot in this series?
I mean, it's a double-edged sword. The way I look at it is that it definitely is a great learning tool for all the sort of kids looking to go up to Formula One. And we've seen just again the talent that have come through to our series. Yes, you get the odd pay driver that comes through, but that's sort of motor racing for you. But generally, these kids are serious about going up to Formula One or whatever, and they use this time pretty efficiently. And as a result, they're not here to muck about. They're here to win championships. They're here to get the super license points. And they've got all that backing, and they've got all the, ritzy titsy sort of engineers, trainers, personal chefs, whatever, like that's just sort of what comes with it. And you're going up against these New Zealand racing drivers who could barely afford to pay the Uber to get to the track. Because New Zealand drivers, we don't have many rich ones here. And as a result, it does become difficult for local talent to get onto the grid. But again, being in that sort of snake pit, really, it encourages them to perform on the main stage, like Liam Lawson did in 2019. And subsequently, he got the Red Bull backing, and he's just, taken it and ran with it, really. So, yeah, I think where the championship is at now, with the internationals coming through, albeit lack of New Zealand drivers, I think it's in a good space. Probably need to add about 10 more cars to the grid, though.
Be a fun time adding more cars, but you've obviously mentioned a few of the competitors and the winners earlier in this sort of interview. But what are some of the names who've really won the series since 2005? If you were to go through the honor roll, who do you think people would recognize out of the victors of the Drivers' Championship?
Right. So the winners of the Toyota Racing Series include Earl Bamber, Mitch Evans, Nick Cassidy, who's won it three times, Lance Stroll, Lando Norris, Robert Schwartzman, who's now in Formula 2, looking to go up to Formula 1, Liam Lawson, escaping me right now, Lando Norris, yeah, for some reason, there's this blank period in in the time frame that I'm just sort of completely forgetting at the moment. Nevertheless, those are the champions that have come through. And when it comes to just the alumni, it's just endless with the amount of people that have come through. So yeah, and of course Yuki Tsunoda, who came through last year through the series. And yeah, sorry, I just went blank there. I got no idea why.
It's all right.
But nevertheless, it is still like, considering the type of series it is and where we are with respect to the rest of the world, it's still quite a decent list of drivers, of course.
Sure, and you mentioned obviously, it helped put Liam Lawson on the map, so that's great. And just back to Josh's point of the competitive nature of this Drivers' Championship, so the 5 of the past 7 championships weren't decided until the very last race of the entire series, and Lance Stroll and Lando Norris are the only 2 out of those 7 who were able to snatch the title in the penultimate race. So that's the one before the last. So that's an interesting fact. And they're obviously both in F1. And no matter what you think about Lance Stroll, he is a good driver. And Lando Norris obviously playing straight from McLaren. So as Josh has said, so there's just a lot of talent that have come through the Toyota Racing Series. And, it's back underway for 2021. So I think we should just mention the structure of this year. It's no international drivers. What have you made of that?
It's difficult because I was made aware of the international, like who was coming through. I'm really not sure I could say who was coming over, but all I'll say is that it would have been quite an interesting few drivers that would have come through here. But of course,
was it sponsored by Rich Energy or?
Nah, we had one of those last year actually with Peter Petacek. He was walking around with the Rich Energy suit. I'm just like, oh, really? It made its way over here. But no, the point overall is that it was all just dogged down due to the quarantine rulings, which, in a word, it sucked. But at the end of it, what we got was sort of this wild card field, and you just saw like this sort of occasion that you'd never ever see again. It was sort of almost the best of our best going against each other, and we saw a crack of a race, last weekend as a result.
Yeah, well, let's just remind everyone. So the 2021 Toyota Racing Series kicked off last weekend, and it was a Grand Prix weekend. So for those who don't know, it actually is considered a GP. So Josh, what's the history there before we get stuck into the actual results?
An interesting stat, actually.
I love it.
2015, yes, 2015 was the event where Sir Lancelot Stroll won the race. And technically speaking, it is an FIA accredited Grand Prix. So it is legitimate. So technically speaking, is he one of only 8 drivers on the grid so far who have technically won a Grand Prix?
I really rate that. Yes. If it's accredited. Yes.
It is. So, it's all legitimate as much as Macau. And yeah, I mean, I remember actually when he came down here, and Lando Norris too. I mean, there are interesting stories about those two when they came down here for the Toyota Racing Series, and just stuff in the paddock that you hear about, and it makes you just go, what? But nevertheless, though, again, you could just see how both of those guys were driving, and you hear about the money and all this stuff, and of course I've mentioned that too, but at the end of the day, like, there are plenty of rich people that come through the ranks, and we got, for example, Alessio Deletta in Formula 2 right now, who's just hot garbage no matter how much money that they throw at the sport. So I mean, money helps you, but it doesn't win your races. So as you just rightly pointed out before, Sir Lancelot does deserve a little bit more recognition, and his junior career is just strewn full of success. But Yeah. I mean, again, the history of the people that have won the event, it does include Lando Norris. Trying to bring up the other
Ruvela?
names. Daravala, yep. KK Rosberg won it. Teo Fabi, Bruce McLaren, John Surtees, Jackie Stewart, Sterling Moss, Chris Simon. It will come to me. Roberto Moreno, who in turn coached last year's Grand Prix winner, Igor Fraga. Shane Van Gisbergen won this year's Grand Prix.
So Jack has won it a few times.
Who? Sorry,
Sir Jack.
Yep, Sir Jack Brabham. Yep. So I mean, yeah, especially in the '60s, just it was basically a legitimate Formula One event. It was that type of grid, those types of cars. We need the Tasman series back, really. we do need that. Although I can't imagine Sir Lewis Hamilton coming down here to compete in the TRS cars, though. Shame, but that's just the way it is.
Still probably dominate everyone and everything, including the pits. Yeah, well, I really enjoy that fact that, we can consider all of these guys that a lot of people wouldn't really rate as a GP winner. As you said, it's obviously recognized by the FAA, and it all kicked off on the weekend. Obviously, take the Toyota Racing Series into its 2021 season. Let's just go straight into it, Josh. Give me a breakdown of the race. It was a pretty special win for, one of the more recognizable drivers down here in the Southern Hemisphere. He's a V8 supercar driver.
Yeah. As I mentioned going into the Grand Prix weekend on the video that I made, you may not know a lot about the people that are racing in this series, but it's just strewn full of talent. And, we saw this weekend that even with the likes of Van Gisbergen or Chris Vanderdrift or whoever, there was still those young kids who were really pushing them along. And I mean, but Shane was dominant all weekend, and I think most people would expect that because Van Gisbergen is just exceptional in every regard. If he wasn't built like Groot and was 6'7", he probably would have made it to Formula One because he just can pedal a car. Like, he's really damn good behind the wheel. But then, they said he's starting from pit lane. I just thought, well, yeah, I don't know. I don't think he can climb that deficit in that period of time. But, stuff happened and he did exactly that. Meanwhile, up and down the pack, it was a chance really for some local talent such as Caleb Nartor and Matthew Payne to show what they're capable of. Especially if they're the ages that they are, and they can hang with some of these guys that have been racing for 10, 12, 14 years. It speaks volumes really for everyone watching on. Yeah, I mean, and it attracted a really, really good crowd at Hampton Downs too. Probably one of the biggest crowds that I've seen for a New Zealand Grand Prix at all. And I think, with how much the race actually got shared around after the fact, it's really done a lot of good for the Grand Prix as a whole. Especially when you see such an epic drive like what Shane had to come from the pit lane to win the race overall, and to do those donuts at the end in an F3 car, which you just never see at all.
Yeah, and I think for those who might not know, he's quite competitive in just about everything he does. Even I think it was even last year he finished third in the eventual V8 Supercar Championship. He just sort of puts himself in the right spots all the time. He's a champion. I think it was back in 2016 he won Supercars overall. He was the champion. So it's great to see a driver like Shane perform so well in something that was being shared around. As you said, I think this, just given the circumstances, I think this is one of the biggest NZGPs ever. I don't remember there being such fanfare around it other than 2021 away from the normal New Zealand Australian feeds, if you will.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, and who were some of the legends involved of this race? So obviously it wasn't just Shane. There's a fair few others. So who would you put in that category? Who got out there and made some older race fans reminisce in New Zealand?
Well, there was Greg Murphy, 4-time Bathurst winner. He's obviously extremely well known, as is the legendary number 51, but he's been retired now for a better part of what? 6-7 years. So for him to go racing again, I think it was a chance really for older fans to reminisce, and also for the younger fans to catch a glimpse of him in action. There was Daniel Gaunt, 2-time New Zealand Grand Prix winner, 2-time Toyota Racing Series champion, but he doesn't really do much in the way of professional racing no more. Kenny Smith, 79 years young, going out there for his 50th Grand Prix. And I met up with him in the weekend, and his shoulder was just killing him. And it was pretty... Yeah, I just thought, oh, God, he may not finish the Grand Prix, but he did. And just... I mean, he was never gonna win it, but it was never the point of him racing. It was just completing the Grand Prix, and he did that. And the ovation he got at the end was so well deserved. Just he already was a legend in New Zealand motorsport. He'll go down as an immortal now. Like, just nobody can really find fault with how he did that weekend. In terms of other legends,
Well, just a fun fact on Ken Smith, he did win he's won the New Zealand Grand Prix 3 times, 1976, 1990, and then in 2004. And then in 2021, yes, he placed, I think it was last, but in car number 50 for his 50 GP. So that is an immense story.
Exactly.
And as you said, he's definitely a legend. And who at 79, nearly 80 years old, gets into a bloody race car to race against some of New Zealand's finest, quickest cut racers?
Well, maybe not New Zealand's finest, but Morgan Shepherd in NASCAR, I think, is still trying to race at 79 years old too. Just
Jeez.
Their madness.
Different breed of people.
Exactly.
So, well, let's talk about your personal feelings then. Your personal feelings on the race weekend, seeing some of these legends and some of these younger guys and, just someone like Shane get around. For you personally, what was it like to see the New Zealand GP actually go in 2021?
I mean, it's great. Well, I mean, for the last few years, it was held at Manfield, which I always felt was not the right call. It was not a track which I felt was worthy of a Grand Prix. And that it needed to go to a more central location and get better publicity, better advertising. And it was pretty decent this year when it comes to advertising and promoting the event. But still, though, to be at New Zealand Grand Prix and see the crowd that we had and see the hype, people arriving at the gates early for the event, it was something that you didn't generally see. This was, exceptional. And I think having those wild cards in there definitely helped. Otherwise, the general New Zealand geezer doesn't know who Caio Collet is, or Franco Colapinto, or Igor Fraga, whereas, fanatics, we know about them. But, the general public doesn't know. To have the familiar names there, it definitely helped out. As did Kenny Smith's 50th Grand Prix appearance. But, while it was disappointing to not have any international drivers this year, this accentuated the Grand Prix more so than any other time, really, that I can remember. And that's sort of the crucial thing, really. So hopefully the momentum can be kept going into 2022.
Yeah, I guess that's my next question. What's the future of racing in New Zealand like off the back of something like this? And, we don't know what's going to be happening in a year when it comes to the global, racing community. So do you think this is a good opportunity for New Zealand racing to maybe take advantage of probably their top-notch showpiece event?
It should be. I just don't know, given the history of New Zealand motorsport, whether that's something they're obliged to. because we got an interesting motorsport sort of culture over here. So, like they could very easily take what happened this year and run with it. But yeah, I mean, having said all of that, those wild cards that we've mentioned before, they were only for the Grand Prix. For the remainder of the TRS season this year, due to the effects of COVID, due to the international restrictions there and everything like that, it's quite a depleted field, and that could hurt the championship in the end. It's very 50-50 in that regard. So I'm sort of waiting with sort of eager anticipation just to see what will come of it, because next year I think if they can't get any international drivers in, I'm not sure how many New Zealanders can afford to go racing full time in the Toyota Racing Series, especially if there isn't going to be much international attention brought onto the series. But we got to remain optimistic. And
you can donate to Josh's GoFundMe now.
Yeah, just help me into some people into the New Zealand Grand Prix. Actually, I actually tried doing that. I actually tried helping fund one of the drivers onto the Grand Prix, but all last minute stuff deal fell through, which kind of sucked.
It does.
But yeah, I think really, again, this Grand Prix did a lot of good for New Zealand motorsport. And again, if they can keep the momentum up and they can sort of up their game with the advertising for next year's event, get in some international drivers, and as I've suggested as well, get a couple of wild cards from overseas, like some, people that'll be willing to come over and race the event who are well known throughout the motor racing world. And again, they could get more eyes onto the product. And that's obviously what we want. We want the New Zealand Grand Prix to obviously just become more and more of a celebrated event worldwide.
And just one final question. It's probably something, maybe people in New Zealand contemplate, but do you think there'll ever be a New Zealand F1 event moving forward? Can we somehow get some momentum behind something like this and end up with one in Australia and one in New Zealand? By 2050, it seems like the calendar is going to be 60 races. So there's probably some opportunity.
I've always advocated there should be an African Grand Prix before anything else. You need to get the race over in South Africa, mate. But no, I think, the feasibility of a Grand Prix in New Zealand would never be there unless there was a Kiwi driver, because New Zealanders are the king of bandwagoners. So it's just like, there's no Kiwis in the race. Okay, I'm not going to watch the race. That's basically sort of the consensus of it all. But, if there was a billionaire with, willing to make a racetrack and organize the event, and there's a Kiwi on the grid, there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle, not the very big pieces. It's not impossible, but under the current climate, yeah, a bit improbable at the stage, I would say. But, I mean, you never know.
No. All right, Josh, well, thank you so much for joining us. Where can everyone find you?
On YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, or somewhere else. I don't know. But the main platform is YouTube. So Josh, Josh, space Revell, Revell. I temporarily forgot how to spell my name, but that's the channel for you. Don't watch anything sort of past July 2020 though. What's the newest stuff?
Including you berating the movie Cars 2.
Yeah, that movie, video went down really well.
We'll leave it as a bit of a teaser. Thank you so much, Josh. Thanks for joining the Getting a Grip F1 podcast.
No worries. Thanks very much for having me on.
Ricardo goes for it from a long way back. This would be sensational if he makes it. And do you know what? He has made it. Smiles will be out at 18 years and 227 days old. Max Verstappen wins a Formula One Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton wins Portuguese Grand Prix, Hamilton has more wins than any other driver in Formula One history. And he is not done yet.